They stood me in the hallway outside my own father's study while his lawyer read the will inside, because my stepmother said the room was for people with a real stake in the family, and I was, in her exact words, just the soldier daughter. I did not argue. I settled my weight onto the leg that still aches before it rains, laced my hands together in front of me, and let them decide, on the other side of that door, what was mine. I stood in that hallway and listened to them divide a fortune that did not exist until my blood built the first floor of it. I was in low heels and a black dress, with a folded leg brace hidden underneath it, because 17 years earlier I had left part of my body in a ditch in Kandahar province, and every step still costs me something the people inside that room never had to learn to pay. And I already knew that in 9 minutes, 3 black government sedans were going to pull into that driveway, and nothing in that house was going to belong to the people who put me outside the door ever again.
Let me take you back far enough that you'll understand exactly what that hallway cost me, and exactly what it was about to cost them.
The Calloway house sits at the end of Birchwood Lane in a small Ohio town, a big colonial with white columns and a circular drive that my father built with his own hands, out of a hardware store and a dream. Or so the story goes at every dinner party my stepmother has ever thrown. That is her story. It was never the whole one. But I am getting ahead of myself, and this one only makes sense in the order it happened. I flew in from Fort Campbell 3 days before the funeral, in uniform, because my father had asked me once, years back, half joking and half not, to be buried the way I would want to be buried, in whatever you're proudest of, Ren. Don't let Denise talk you into a suit. I wore the dress blues to the funeral. I changed into civilian clothes for the reading of the will, because something in me already knew, walking up that driveway, that the blues would only give my stepmother something else to resent. I want to be precise about who was in that house, because it matters. My stepmother, Denise Calloway, married my father just 2 years before I was injured, back when I was a young lieutenant, 3,000 miles away, learning how to lead a platoon. Denise came into the family already knowing exactly what she wanted from it, and what she wanted was never me. She had a son from her first marriage, Tyler, 4 years younger than me, and by the time I came home for my second deployment, missing part of my left leg below the knee, Tyler had already learned to call my father Dad in the easy, entitled way that only works when nobody in the house is going to correct you. I do not say any of this with self-pity. I say it because it is the truth, and the truth is the whole engine of what happened later. My father, Harold Calloway, ran a hardware store on 5th Street for 11 years, before it became something bigger. By the time he died, Calloway Group was a construction and property development company, worth, on paper, north of $18 million. Office parks, a chain of self-storage facilities, half a strip mall on the county line. Denise liked to tell people at church that Harold had built it from nothing but grit and a dream. She said it so often I think she came to believe it herself, the way people believe anything they say enough times in rooms full of people who are never going to check. 300 people came to the funeral. Business partners, county officials, men my father had trained on job sites 20 years earlier who now ran crews of their own. Denise worked the receiving line in a black Chanel suit that had cost, by her own mention at a birthday dinner 18 months before, more than a staff sergeant makes in 4 months. To every mourner, she offered the same soft hand on the forearm and the same line, "Harold built something extraordinary, and I intend to make sure his legacy is protected," until the words stopped sounding like grief and started sounding like a press release. She never once said my name. I stood 2 feet to her left in my dress blues, and a dozen times I watched someone's eyes catch the uniform, catch the resemblance around my father's eyes, and start to ask. Every time, Denise moved the conversation somewhere else before the question finished forming. "This is Tyler, Harold's son," she'd say, and the line simply ended before it reached me. I told myself grief makes people strange. I no longer believe that. I believe I was watching the opening moves of what would happen in that hallway 11 days later. I was in a hospital bed when the company was born. That is not a metaphor. It happened in the room. I will tell you about the road, because you need the road before you can understand the hallway. It was 2008. I was 26 years old, a first lieutenant, 6 months into my second tour, running a resupply convoy through a stretch of Kandahar province that had been quiet for 11 straight days.
The exact kind of quiet you learn to distrust and never quite manage to. The lead vehicle hit a pressure plate IED buried under a culvert that 4 different patrols had crossed clean in the 2 weeks before. I was in the second vehicle.
The blast took the front axle off the lead truck and threw shrapnel and debris across 40 meters of open road. And it took my leg below the knee. And it took most of the hearing in my left ear for 6 months. And it took for about 90 seconds. I have never fully gotten back from my own memory, my ability to do anything at all, except lie on packed dirt and understand, with a clarity I have never had about anything since, that I might be finished. I do not tell that story for entertainment. I am not going to turn a road in Kandahar into a scene for you. Here is what you need to know. I lived because a staff sergeant named Joe Reyes, who did not have to, put a tourniquet on what was left of my leg with his own hands, under fire, and stayed on top of me until the medevac bird found a place to land. He never let me thank him properly. Soldiers like that never do. He told me once, months later, in the hallway of a hospital in Germany, the only thing he was ever going to say about it, that everybody has one day where the ground stops making sense, and the only thing that matters afterward is what you build on the other side of it. He said it like he was reading off an inventory list. That was Joe. I carry that sentence the way some people carry scripture. I woke up in land stool with one leg and a Purple Heart on the way, and 6 weeks later, a settlement number, combat-related permanent disability, a negligence claim against the contractor who'd cleared that stretch of road and cleared it wrong, a VA disability rating at 100%, a lump sum settlement of just under $340,000, plus a monthly compensation payment that was going to follow me for the rest of my life, whether I wanted it to or not. $340,000 is not a number you know what to do with at 26, in a hospital bed, learning to walk again on a leg that is not the one you were born with. I called my father. I have never told anyone what that phone call actually sounded like, so I will tell you now because it is the beginning of everything that happened in that hallway 17 years later. I told him I didn't want it sitting in a bank account, reminding me every month of the day I earned it. I told him I wanted it to build something, to mean something other than the worst 90 seconds of my life. And my father, who had run that hardware store for 11 years on thin margins and thinner sleep, asked me carefully, the way you ask a question you already know is going to change your life if the answer is yes, whether I would trust him to build something with it. I said yes. I said yes because he was my father, and because Joe Reyes had just spent his own blood keeping mine inside my body, and I did not want to spend the money he bought me on anything that felt smaller than a life. There was no contract. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it is the hinge the entire rest of this story swings on. There was no equity agreement, no promissory note, nothing filed with a lawyer, nothing that would have held up in any courtroom in this country. There was a phone call between a father and a daughter who loved each other, and a handshake he made over the phone that I could not even see. And a promise. Your share is safe with me, Ren. Always. That is a direct quote. I have never forgotten it, because for the next 17 years, it was the only paperwork I had. The VA compensation kept arriving every month after that, and some years it felt lighter than I remembered it should, and I never once sat down to check why. A soldier learns not to look too closely at numbers the government sends her. You take what arrives and you move forward. I would come to regret that particular kind of trust. He built Calloway Group on that $340,000, every brick of it. The hardware store became a contracting outfit. The contracting outfit landed a county project. The county project became a name people trusted, and the name became $18 million of buildings and land and a family fortune that everyone at every dinner party believed had sprung fully formed from a man's grit and a dream, without once mentioning the daughter who signed her own settlement check over the phone from a hospital bed in Germany. I never asked for it back. I never asked for a title, a salary, a seat on anything. I built a military career instead, moved every 2 years, made captain, made major, ran a company, then a battalion staff section, then took over as battalion executive officer at Fort Campbell, second in command of 412 soldiers who called me ma'am on the good days and meant it. My father and I talked every Sunday. He never once in 17 years spoke about the money out loud. And because he never spoke about it, I let myself believe it did not need to be spoken about. I let myself believe the handshake was enough, because he was my father, and because that is the mistake people make about family. They think love and paperwork are the same instrument. They are not.
I would learn that in a hallway, standing in low heels, 11 days after we buried him.
My father died on a Tuesday in March, a stroke in his sleep, 71 years old. No warning, no chance for the conversation I now understand he had been quietly trying to have with me for at least a year before he died. The conversation about setting the record straight, about finally putting my name on paper where it should have been for a decade and a half. I did not know that conversation had been coming. I only found out how close he had gotten to finishing it in the very room they tried to keep me out of. I flew home for the funeral. I stood at the graveside in my dress uniform, because it was the one thing I had left that felt like armor, and Denise did not comment on it, because Denise saves her comments for rooms where an audience can see her make them. 2 days before the will was read, she and Tyler sat me down at the kitchen table, my father's kitchen table, the one he'd built the cabinets around himself 20 years before either of them moved into that house, and put a document in front of me. A waiver. Clean legal language, a lawyer's letterhead I didn't recognize, and at the bottom, a line for my signature, under a paragraph that said, in essence, that I acknowledged having already received my full and fair share of any Calloway family assets, and that I relinquished, permanently and irrevocably, any further claim to the estate, to Calloway Group, its holdings, its accounts, or its future proceeds. "You already got yours, Ren," Denise said. She said it the way you'd remind someone they already had dessert. "Years ago. Your father was very clear with me about that. This just makes it official, so there's no confusion for the lawyers." I sat there with the pen in my hand, and I felt something very old and very familiar rise up in me. The specific, cold, disorienting sensation of being told by someone with absolute confidence a version of my own history that was not true, built on the very sacrifice they were using against me. I had gotten mine, as though a leg was a bank withdrawal, as though the $340,000 that built the floor they were standing on had been a gift instead of a debt they had never once acknowledged, let alone repaid. "There's a car," Tyler added, not quite looking at me, staring at his phone like the conversation was beneath his full attention. "A 911. I found one in Columbus. Dad always said when the company hit a certain number, he'd help me get one. Mom just wants to make sure the estate's clean before probate, so nobody's fighting over who gets what for months." My father, 11 days in the ground, and the future they were already spending on my signature was a sports car for a 28-year-old who had never worked a single day at Calloway Group. I did not sign it. I told them I wanted my own attorney to review it first, and I watched Denise's face do the thing it does when a plan meets resistance it did not expect. A flicker, gone in under a second, replaced by a smile that had absolutely nothing behind it. "Of course," she said. "Take your time. The reading's Thursday. We'll just need it settled by then, for everyone's sake." For everyone's sake. I have thought about that phrase more times than I can count since. It is the phrase people use when what they actually mean is, for my sake, and they know it would sound worse said honestly. I called an old friend from law school that night, a JAG officer I'd served with years back who now did estate work in his family's practice. I did not tell him the whole story. I only asked in the most careful, non-committal voice I could manage what it would take, legally, for an unwritten 17-year-old verbal agreement about company seed capital to hold up against a signed release. He was honest with me. Without paperwork, without so much as a canceled check with a memo line, it would be an uphill fight. My word against a company's books, and companies keep their books the way that favors the people who run them. I hung up that phone in a hotel room 11 miles from the house I grew up in, and for the first time since Kandahar, I let myself feel something close to why I'd felt lying in that dirt. Not fear of dying, but fear of a different kind. The fear of being erased by people who had decided, calmly and at their convenience, exactly how much of my own life I was allowed to keep. I did not sign the waiver. I told them Thursday morning I would need until after the reading. Denise's mouth went thin, but she said nothing, because she already had a plan for Thursday that did not require my signature at that exact moment. She had, as I would learn 9 minutes into that reading, a much better idea of how the day would go than I did. The reading was set for 10 o'clock in my father's study, the one room in that house he had insisted stay exactly as it had been before Denise ever set foot in it. Dark wood shelving, a leather chair with a permanent impression of him still in the seat, a framed photo of my mother that Denise had never once asked him to take down, which was, I think, the one piece of decency I could always credit her with. I arrived at 9:45. There were already 11 people in that study. The family attorney, Mr. Whitmore, a small, precise man with reading glasses pushed up into thinning white hair, Denise, Tyler, 2 Calloway Group business partners I recognized from photographs but had never met, Denise's sister, and a handful of others whose presence at my father's will reading I have still, to this day, never had explained to me. I walked toward the leather chair nearest the desk, not out of entitlement, but because it was the chair closest to where my mother's photograph sat, and some part of me wanted to be near it while a stranger read out loud what remained of my father in legal language. Denise stepped into my path before I'd taken 3 steps into the room. She did not raise her voice. She lowered it, the pitch people use when they want cruelty to sound like consideration. "Ren, honey," she said, "this is really for the people with a direct stake in the business, the partners, the family who's actually been part of building this thing day to day. I think it'd be easier for everyone if you just waited outside. We won't be long." A couple of the business partners exchanged a look. Not a cruel look, worse than that. A small, practical, agreeing look. The look of people quietly deciding that a minor inconvenience was being handled correctly. I did not argue. I want to tell you exactly why, because I have thought about it every day since, and it is not the reason people assume. I did not argue because I already understood, standing in that doorway, that a scene inside that room would hand Denise exactly the story she wanted to tell. The difficult stepdaughter, disruptive at her father's own reading, embarrassing the family in front of his business partners 11 days after his funeral. I had learned the hard way, over 17 years and one very long convalescence, that the loudest response to an insult is very often the one that costs you the most and buys the insulter the least. I had learned that from Joe Reyes, who never raised his voice about anything that actually mattered, and reserved his volume entirely for the 2 or 3 times a life needed saving. So I turned around and I walked back into the hallway, and I stood there in low heels on hardwood floor, with my hand resting lightly against the frame of a door that used to be open to me every single day of my childhood, and I listened to them decide on the other side of it what was mine. There is a particular kind of stillness that comes over you in a moment like that, and I want to describe it honestly instead of dramatically, because I think the honest version is more useful to you. It is not rage, not at first. Rage would have been easier. Rage has somewhere to go. What I felt, standing in that hallway in a dead man's house, was closer to the stillness I remember from the 90 seconds after the blast in Kandahar, before the pain fully arrived, when my body understood something my mind had not yet caught up to. I understood, standing there, that I had spent 17 years assuming a version of my place in that family that had never actually been agreed to by anyone but me. My father's handshake had been real. My father's love had been real. But a handshake is not a deed, and love, it turns out, is not always enough to keep a room open to you once the person who loved you is no longer standing in the doorway to hold it open himself. I thought, standing there, about every Sunday phone call for 17 years, where I had let the silence about the money sit unspoken, because breaking that silence had always felt to me like an accusation against a father I loved. I understand now that my silence had not protected him. It had only given someone else 17 years of uncontested room to write a different history in his place, one dinner party and one receiving line at a time, until the true one had almost nowhere left to live, except inside my own memory, and a door that was, at that exact moment, closed to me. Through the door, muffled, I heard Whitmore's voice, dry and procedural, reading through the preliminary sections: the house to Denise, a set of specific bequests, a small trust for Tyler's education that had clearly already been spent on things education does not usually require. And then he paused, a long pause.
The kind of pause that, even through a closed door, changes the temperature of a room. "There's an amended codicil," Whitmore said, "executed 4 months ago. I need to read this exactly as written." I heard Denise's voice cut in, sharp. 4 months ago? Harold didn't mention any amendment to me. "It was notarized and filed with my office directly," Whitmore said. "Mr. Calloway asked that it be kept confidential until the reading." And then he read it. I did not hear every word clean through a closed oak door, but I heard enough, and what I heard changed the shape of the rest of that morning entirely. My father had gone alone, 4 months before his death, to Whitmore's office and executed an amended codicil that assigned a 40% equity stake in Calloway Group directly to me, not to the estate, not through Denise, directly to me by name, along with a personal letter to be read into the record. Whitmore read the letter. I will not pretend to have every word of it memorized the way I have Joe Reyes's sentence memorized, but I will tell you the heart of it. He wrote that he had spent 17 years intending to make it right, and 17 years finding reasons to put it off, because peace in a house is a fragile thing, and he had been afraid of what the truth would cost that peace. He wrote that the company that bore his name had actually been built on his daughter's blood and his daughter's settlement and his daughter's trust, and that every year he let that fact go unspoken was a year he was, in his own words, living in a house I did not fully deserve to call mine. He wrote that he loved his wife and his stepson, and that this was not a punishment of them, only a correction, a debt finally paid, 17 years late, to the one person in that family who had never once asked him to pay it. Through the door, I heard silence. Then I heard Denise's voice, no longer lowered, no longer careful, rising into something closer to panic than anger. "This isn't right. This isn't... He wouldn't have done this without telling me. Someone manipulated him. He was sick. He wasn't himself." "Mrs. Calloway," Whitmore said, "he was of entirely sound mind. I personally witnessed the signing." I stood in that hallway with my hand still on the doorframe, and I felt something I had not expected to feel, standing outside a room I'd just been told I did not belong in. I did not feel triumphant. I felt mostly a very old and very simple grief. The grief of understanding that my father had spent the last months of his life quietly trying to fix something, and had run out of time to also find the courage to fix it out loud, to my face, while he still could. He left me the truth in writing because he could not manage to say it in a kitchen. That is its own kind of sorrow, and I have made peace with it slower than I made peace with the leg. The door opened 4 minutes later. Denise stood in the frame, and for the first time in 17 years, I watched her look at me the way you look at someone whose name you suddenly need to remember correctly. "Ren," she said, "come in. We need to talk about this like a family." I want to be honest about the 2 roads that opened up in front of me the second I walked back through that door, because I suspect you have stood at a version of this fork yourself, and I do not think enough people tell the truth about how hard the middle path actually is. The first road was easy, in the way that surrender is always easy. I could have let it go, accepted their apology, whatever thin version of it they were about to offer, and quietly allowed the waiver to reappear on the desk, because a scene over money in a room where my father's ashes were barely settled felt to some old part of me like a betrayal of him rather than a defense of myself. 17 years of biting my tongue on Sunday phone calls had built that muscle strong. The second road was just as easy, in its own way, and far more satisfying for about 4 seconds. I could have stood in that doorway and said the whole truth out loud, in front of the partners, in front of Denise's sister, in front of everyone. The phone call from Germany, the $340,000, the 17 years of silence, the word grit Denise had used at 100 dinner parties to describe a story that was actually mine. It would have flattened her in front of an audience, and some old, tired, wounded part of me wanted that flattening very badly. I did neither. I walked to the chair by my mother's photograph, and I sat down, and I said only this: "I'd like to hear the rest of the reading before anyone talks about anything else." Whitmore, visibly relieved to have somewhere procedural to put his attention, continued. The 40% stake was not the only surprise in that codicil.
My father had also instructed that a full independent audit of Calloway Group's accounts be conducted before any further distribution, a line Whitmore read almost apologetically, as though he too sensed it was a small bomb placed quietly inside a legal document. Denise's face, when he read it, did something I will remember for the rest of my life. It did not go pale with grief. It went pale with the specific fear of a person who knows exactly what an audit is going to find.
I did not know yet what that fear was about. I would in 11 minutes.
Denise recovered faster than I expected. She always did. She waited until Whitmore finished, thanked him with a composure that must have cost her everything she had left, and then asked him, very reasonably, whether the family could have the room for a few minutes before continuing to the remaining bequests. He agreed. The partners filed out. Denise's sister filed out. And then it was Denise, Tyler, and me in my father's study, with his empty leather chair between us like a fourth person no one wanted to look at directly.
"This doesn't have to be complicated," Denise said, and she said it in the voice she used for closing deals, not the voice she used for brief. "Your father wasn't well at the end, Ren. We both know that. A stroke doesn't come out of nowhere. There were months before it where he wasn't sharp, where he made decisions he wouldn't have made healthy. I'm not saying he didn't love you. I'm saying a 40% stake sprung on the family with no warning 4 months before he died, a judge is going to look at that and see exactly what it is."
He was sound of mind, I said. Whitmore just said so, on the record, as the witnessing attorney.
"Whitmore works for this family," Tyler said, finally looking up from his phone, "which means Whitmore says what keeps this family out of court." He slid a folder across the desk toward me, the same waiver from 2 days before, printed fresh, a pen resting neatly on top of it. "Look, nobody's trying to screw you over here. We're trying to keep this simple. You sign, we settle the estate clean and fast, and Mom will make sure you're taken care of. A settlement, whatever's fair. But this," he tapped the folder that held the codicil, "this drags everything into probate court for a year, maybe 2, while the company bleeds legal fees and everybody's business partners start wondering if Calloway Group is falling apart. Is that really what Dad would have wanted? A public mess?" I looked at the pen, I looked at the waiver, and I felt the old reflex again. The one Joe Reyes spent months sanding down in me after Kandahar. The reflex that says a scene is expensive and quiet compliance is free. It is never actually free. It only feels that way in the moment you're being asked to pay it.
"I want my own attorney to review the codicil and the audit order before I sign anything," I said. "The same thing I told you 2 days ago." Denise's composure cracked, just slightly, at the edges. "There isn't time for that, Ren. This needs to be resolved today." "Why today?" I asked. It was the first real question I had asked out loud that entire visit, and I watched it land somewhere I had not expected. I watched Tyler's eyes flick, just for a fraction of a second, toward his mother, the particular look of a young man who has been told part of a plan and not the rest of it, and has just realized in real time that the rest of it might be the part that matters. Denise did not answer the question. Instead, she picked up the pen herself and held it out to me, her voice dropping into that same lowered, careful register from the hallway. "Sign it, Ren," she said, "for your father's memory, so we don't turn his death into a circus." I had the pen in my hand. I want to be honest with you about that, because the truth is more useful to you than a clean story where I never wavered. I had the pen in my hand, and some old, tired, grieving part of me that just wanted the whole thing to be over was already moving my hand toward the signature line when the front door of the house opened without a knock, and I heard from the front hall, boots, several sets, even, unhurried, the specific, unmistakable cadence of people who do not knock because they do not need to. Denise heard it too. I watched every muscle in her face change at once. A man's voice, calm and procedural, came from the front hall. "Denise Calloway? Tyler Calloway. We have a federal order to secure the premises and freeze all financial accounts associated with Calloway Group and the Calloway Family Trust, effective immediately." Tyler stood up so fast his chair scraped a groove into the hardwood. "What is this?" I set the pen down. I had not signed anything. I want that on the record. I had come within one motion of signing away everything my father had spent the last 4 months of his life trying to give back to me, and the only reason I didn't was a knock that never came, replaced by boots that didn't need to. 3 people came into the study. 2 wore plain federal law enforcement windbreakers, Army Criminal Investigation Division, and a third badge behind them I recognized from a very different part of my life, the Department of Veterans Affairs Office of Inspector General. The lead agent, a woman in her 40s named Special Agent Dana Ruse, introduced herself with the flat, competent posture of someone who has walked into this exact kind of room more times than she could count. "Mrs. Calloway," she said, "we have a federal seizure order for financial records related to Calloway Group and associated personal accounts, pursuant to an active investigation into fraud involving federal veterans' disability benefits. We'll need everyone to step away from any documents on that desk." Denise's voice, when it came, had lost every ounce of the composure she'd walked into that room with an hour earlier. "This is insane. This is my husband's estate. My husband just died." "We're aware, ma'am," Ruiz said, not unkindly. "This investigation predates his death by several years." Here is what they told me, standing in that study, and what I have since had confirmed piece by piece. In 2009, less than a year after my injury, Denise had me sign, or believed she had me sign, a limited power of attorney. I do not have a clear memory of signing it. I was on painkillers for a service-connected nerve injury for the better part of 8 months that year, and I have entire stretches of that period I cannot reliably account for. The document authorized Denise to manage disbursement of my ongoing monthly VA disability compensation during a period of medical incapacity. It was never formally rescinded when my capacity returned, because Denise never told me it needed to be, and I, trusting my father's new wife inside my father's house, never thought to ask. For 16 years, a portion of my monthly federal disability compensation had been quietly redirected, through an account Denise controlled, into Calloway Group's operating funds. Not the whole amount. She was careful, the way people are careful when they've convinced themselves a theft isn't really a theft if it's small enough and slow enough. Careful, over 16 years, still adds up. Agent Marcus Cole from the VAOIG told me later that the total diverted came to just under $260,000, federal veterans benefits, funneled without my knowledge or consent, into a company that already owed its very existence to money I'd given willingly. And here is the piece that turned an ugly family secret into a federal case. 2 years earlier, when the VA had requested updated authorization for the continuing arrangement, Denise had submitted a renewed power of attorney bearing my signature. I did not sign it. On the exact date that document claimed to have been notarized in Ohio, I was 3 time zones away at the National Training Center in California on a training rotation, with a duty roster that put me in a specific operations center at the specific hour of the signing. My father had found the discrepancy himself, 8 months before he died, going through the company's financial records after an unrelated disagreement with Denise. That discovery led him to Whitmore's office, to the codicil, to the audit order, and I believe, though I will never know for certain, to a call he made to a federal agency he never told me about. 3 months before his stroke, someone using a private email address sent the VA Office of Inspector General an anonymous tip, along with copies of internal Calloway Group ledgers, flagging the exact irregularity his own audit request would later formalize in writing. Cole did not say outright that my father had sent it. He did not have to. Ruiz laid it out for the room plainly. Forgery of a federal document, wire fraud, theft of government benefits. She used those words standing in front of the leather chair my father used to sit in, and I watched Denise's face go through every stage of understanding that a lie has an expiration date, and hers had just arrived. "I want to speak to a lawyer," Denise said, her voice gone very small. "That's your right," Ruiz said. "Ma'am, Mr. Calloway, I'll need you both to come with us." I want to tell you what I did not do in that room, because it is, I think, the part of this story that actually matters more than the sedans in the driveway. I did not gloat. I did not stand up and announce, in front of federal agents, 17 years of grievance I had every right to announce.
My father spent the last months of his life trying to fix this quietly, with paperwork instead of confrontation, because he understood something I had to relearn standing in that hallway that morning, that the loudest correction of a wrong is very often the smallest one, and that the version of justice worth having does not need an audience to be real.
Special Agent Cole found me afterward, out on the front porch. He'd pulled my service record while building the case, and he told me plainly that the Bureau doesn't usually time a seizure to a will reading, but my father's audit request had given them the final piece 6 weeks before he died, and once the estate started moving toward a signature that would have made civil recovery next to impossible, the timing wasn't a coincidence so much as a deadline they couldn't ignore.
As Cole turned to go, a young staff sergeant from the CID support team crossing the lawn with an evidence box stopped mid-stride, came briefly to attention, and said, "Major Calloway? Staff Sergeant Anand, ma'am, motor pool platoon, 2 years back. You signed my re-enlistment paperwork. It's an honor to be on this detail, ma'am." Then she went back to her box, and I let those few seconds be enough. A young sergeant's kindness on a porch did not undo 16 years of stolen disability payments, and it did not undo 17 years of being told quietly and constantly that I was not quite family in the way that counted. Nothing fills the specific hole a father leaves when he dies before he finishes making something right.
I have learned since Kandahar that some debts do not get repaid in a way that feels like repayment. They only get acknowledged, which is smaller than repayment and somehow still worth almost everything. I will tell you what happened in the weeks after, because the loud version of this story would end on the porch, with the sedans pulling away and Denise's face in the backseat window, and I do not want to give you the loud version. Denise was charged 11 weeks later with theft of government funds, wire fraud, and forgery of a federal document. She took a plea agreement rather than face trial. Full restitution, a suspended sentence contingent on that restitution, and 5 years of supervised probation, and a permanent federal record that will follow her for the rest of her life. Tyler was never charged. Investigators found no evidence he'd known, in any legally actionable sense, where the money in his mother's accounts had come from. Though I have my own private opinion about how much a 28-year-old chooses not to ask when the answers might interrupt a Porsche. He moved out of state within the year. We have not spoken since the rigging, and I have made a slow, imperfect peace with that silence. The audit my father ordered confirmed what I already suspected. The original $340,000 from 2009, adjusted against Callaway Group's growth over 17 years, translated under the codicil into a 40% equity stake, now worth just over $7 million. I did not take a check and walk away. I sit on the board now. I go to quarterly meetings in a blazer instead of a uniform, and I have had to relearn an entirely different kind of leadership than the one that got me through a battalion staff. Quieter, slower, full of spreadsheets instead of operations orders, but leadership all the same, and I think my father would recognize it, even if he never got the chance to see it happen. The VA restored my full compensation once the fraud was confirmed, along with the back payments owed. I do not spend that money on anything that feels like celebration. I never have. It still feels, some months, like a monthly reminder of a road in Kandahar, and I do not think that feeling is ever fully going away, and I have stopped expecting it to. I visited my father's grave alone the week after the arrests, in the late afternoon, after the cemetery had gone quiet. I am not a person who talks to graves. I stood there for a while with my hands in my coat pockets, and I thought about the hallway, and about how close I had come to signing that pen down onto that line before the boots ever reached the front hall. I thought about how the old reflex, the one that says compliance is free and a scene is expensive, never fully leaves you, no matter how many rooms you survive it in. You just get better, slowly, at recognizing it for what it is. I want to talk to you now, whoever you are watching this, because I suspect you have stood in a hallway of your own. Maybe there was no oak door, no lawyer, no federal agents and windbreakers. Maybe it was a kitchen table, or a hospital waiting room, or a family group chat where somebody decided with total confidence and without checking a single fact exactly how much of your own life you are allowed to keep. Somebody looked at you for less than a second and decided you did not belong in the room where the real decisions were being made, not because of anything true about you, but because your absence from that room was convenient to them. Here is what 17 years, one road in Kandahar, and one hallway outside my father's study taught me. And it is the only thing in this whole story I actually want you to keep. You do not have to make yourself small to keep the peace in a room that was never yours to keep peace in. And you do not have to burn the room down to prove you belonged in it either. Both of those are the easy roads, and both of them cost you more than you think they will. The hard road, the one that actually works, is the quiet one. Hold what is true. Do not spend your dignity performing it for people who have already decided not to believe you. Let the paperwork, the timeline, the truth itself do the work that a raised voice never quite manages to do. It takes longer. It is much harder to stand still inside of. But it is the only version of justice I have ever seen that did not cost the person holding it something they could not get back.
My father spent the last 4 months of his life trying, quietly, imperfectly, and too late, to make something right that he had let sit wrong for 17 years. I have decided to let that be enough, because the alternative, staying angry at a man who ran out of time in the middle of fixing his own mistake, is a debt I am no longer willing to keep paying. If somebody has ever stood you outside a room your whole life earned you a seat in, I hope you remember this. Their certainty is not evidence. It is only noise. Sit down where you're allowed to sit. Keep what is yours, and let the truth take the time it needs. It always arrives. It is simply sometimes later than we would like. If this story moved you the way I think it did, tell me in the comments where you were standing when someone decided, without asking you, that you didn't belong in your own family's room. I read everyone, and I promise you, you are not the only person carrying that hallway with you. If you're new here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because every week I bring you another true-to-life story of family, betrayal, and the quiet kind of justice that doesn't need to shout to be real. And if you know someone who's ever been told to wait outside a room they earned, send them this video. Sometimes the only thing a person needs to finally stop signing their life away is proof that someone else already stopped and won. I'll see you in the next one.